One word. That's all it took for Tony the Bull Carelli to lose everything on March 23rd, 1947. One racial slur screamed across a conference table in a smoke-filled room in Lower Manhattan. A room with 12 mob bosses, 6 Italian, 3 Jewish, 2 Irish, and 1 black man, Bumpy Johnson. The meeting was supposed to be about dividing up Brooklyn's waterfront operations, lucrative docks, union control, millions of dollars at stake. Tony Carelli controlled Red Hook, the most profitable section, and he thought his territory was safe, untouchable, because he was Italian, because he had connections, because he'd been in the game for 20 years. But Tony made one fatal mistake. When Bumpy Johnson proposed taking a piece of the Red Hook action, Tony stood up, slammed his fist on the table, and shouted loud enough for everyone to hear, "I'm not giving nothing to some street and asterisk, 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 or who thinks he belongs at this table." The room went silent. 12 mob bosses stared, waiting, because everyone knew you could threaten Bumpy Johnson. You could fight him. You could even try to kill him, but you never, ever disrespected him. Not like that. Not with that word. Bumpy didn't raise his voice, didn't draw a weapon. He just looked at Tony, smiled, and said 7 words that would change the New York underworld forever. "By Friday, Red Hook will be mine." That was Monday, March 23rd, 1947. By Friday, March 28th, Tony the Bull Carelli was dead, and Bumpy Johnson controlled every dock, every union, and every illegal operation in Red Hook, Brooklyn. This is a story of how one slur cost a man his life and his territory, how Bumpy Johnson turned racism into power, and how 5 days of strategic warfare proved that respect, not race, determined who ruled New York. Winter of 1947. New York City's underworld was changing. World War II had just ended. Soldiers were coming home. The economy was booming, and organized crime was more profitable than ever. The Italian mob controlled most of New York. Lucky Luciano was in exile, deported to Italy, but his organization, the Genovese family, still ran the show. Frank Costello was the acting boss. Meyer Lansky handled the money, and dozens of capos and soldiers controlled territories across the 5 boroughs. But nobody knew what was about to happen. In Harlem, Bumpy Johnson had been running the numbers racket since the mid-1930s. He negotiated peace with Lucky Luciano after Dutch Schultz's death in 1935. The deal was simple. Bumpy controlled Harlem. The Italian mob got a percentage. Everyone made money. Everyone stayed in their lane. By 1947, Bumpy was 42 years old. He'd survived gang wars, multiple prison sentences, and attempts on his life. He'd become more than just a gangster. He was Harlem's protector, its banker, its problem solver. And increasingly, he was becoming a power broker in New York's larger criminal network. Frank Costello respected Bumpy. Meyer Lansky did business with him. And while most Italian mobsters still saw Bumpy as an outsider, a black man who'd gotten lucky, the smart ones understood. Bumpy Johnson was dangerous, not just because he was violent, but because he was strategic, calculating, and absolutely unwilling to accept disrespect. But here's what made the situation complicated. The Italian mob in 1947 was still deeply racist. Most of them came from neighborhoods where black people were servants, laborers, the help. The idea that a black man could sit at a table as an equal, negotiate deals, control territory, it challenged everything they believed about the natural order. Some adapted. Costello and Lansky saw Bumpy as a business partner. Others, like Tony the Bull Carelli, never could. Tony Carelli was 51 years old in March 1947. He'd been in the mob since the 1920s. Prohibition, bootlegging, extortion, murder. He'd done it all. By 1947, Tony controlled Red Hook, Brooklyn. The docks, the unions, the illegal gambling, the loan sharking, everything. Red Hook was Tony's kingdom, and he'd built it through violence and intimidation. Tony was old school. He believed the mob should stay Italian, that blacks, Jews, Irish They could work for the Italians, but never with them, never as equals. And the idea that Bumpy Johnson, a black gangster from Harlem, might take a piece of his territory, that was unthinkable. March 20th, 1947. Frank Costello called a meeting. All the major players in New York's underworld. The topic was Brooklyn's waterfront. The docks were generating millions, but there were disputes, overlapping territories, violence between crews. Costello wanted to establish clear boundaries, prevent a war. The meeting was scheduled for March 23rd, 1947, Monday afternoon, 2 o'clock, a private room above an Italian restaurant in Lower Manhattan. That's when everything started to go wrong. Bumpy Johnson received his invitation on March 21st. It was delivered by Meyer Lansky personally. Meyer came to Harlem, sat down with Bumpy at Small's Paradise, and explained the situation. Frank wants to reorganize Brooklyn, create clear territories, stop the violence. You're invited. Bumpy was surprised. Brooklyn wasn't his territory. He'd never operated there. Why am I being invited to a meeting about Brooklyn? Meyer's answer was careful. Because Frank thinks it's time. Time for what? Time for Harlem to expand. Time for you to have interests beyond Harlem. Time for the organization to recognize what you've built. Bumpy understood immediately. This wasn't just about Brooklyn. This was about power, about recognition, about whether a black gangster could operate beyond Harlem, about whether Bumpy Johnson could sit at the table with Italian mob bosses and be treated as an equal. Bumpy agreed to attend. But little did he know, Tony Carelli had been told about the invitation, and Tony was furious. On March 22nd, the day before the meeting, Tony met with 3 of his capos. They gathered at his social club in Red Hook. Tony was pacing, angry. Costello's inviting the Harlem and are to our meeting to discuss our territory, our docks, like he has any right. One of his capos, a man named Sal, tried to calm him down. Boss, Costello invited him. We can't control that, but we can make it clear that Red Hook is off limits. Tony's response was immediate. I'm going to make it very clear. That black bastard isn't taking 1 inch of Brooklyn. Not one dock. Not one union. Nothing. March 23rd, 1947. 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The meeting room above Rao's restaurant in Lower Manhattan was packed. 12 mob bosses. Frank Costello sat at the head of the table. Meyer Lansky to his right. The rest arranged by power and seniority. Tony Carelli sat 4 seats from Frank, a position of respect, a position he'd earned through decades of loyalty and violence. Bumpy Johnson arrived at 1:55, 5 minutes early. He wore an immaculate dark blue suit, a gray fedora, polished shoes. He looked like a banker, not a gangster. When Bumpy walked into the room, conversation stopped. Some of the bosses nodded, respectful. Others just stared, coldly. Bumpy sat down in the empty chair, last seat at the table, furthest from Frank Costello, the position of least power. But nobody knew what Bumpy was planning. Frank Costello started the meeting at 2 o'clock sharp. Gentlemen, thank you for coming. We're here to discuss Brooklyn, specifically the waterfront. We've had too many disputes, too much violence. I want to establish clear territories, clear rules. Everyone makes money. Nobody gets killed. For the next hour, Frank went through the current territories. Who controlled what? Who had claims? Who wanted expansion? It was like a corporate board meeting, except the product was crime. When Frank got to Red Hook, he looked at Tony Carelli. Tony, you've had Red Hook for 15 years. Profitable operation, but there's been complaints. Violence against independent operators. Union leaders disappearing. The longshoremen are scared. Tony's face turned red. Those union leaders were stealing. The independents weren't paying respect. I handle my territory the way it needs to be handled. Frank nodded. I understand, but we need to make some adjustments. That's when Bumpy Johnson spoke for the first time. I'd like to propose a partnership with Red Hook. Bumpy's voice was calm, professional, like he was discussing a real estate deal. The room went tense. Tony Carelli's eyes went wide. A partnership? Bumpy continued. Harlem has connections on the docks. Longshoremen who trust us. Union leaders who respect us. We could smooth out the violence. Make the operations more profitable. Everyone wins. But what nobody expected was Tony's reaction. Tony stood up. His chair scraped loudly across the floor. Every eye turned to him. And Tony, his face red with rage, his fist clenched, made the biggest mistake of his life. He looked directly at Bumpy Johnson. And he said it. I'm not giving nothing to some street and asterisk, or who thinks he belongs at this table. The word hung in the air. Heavy. Poisonous. Frank Costello's face went hard. Meyer Lansky closed his eyes. The other bosses shifted uncomfortably, because everyone knew Tony had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Bumpy didn't move, didn't react. He just stared at Tony. And then he smiled. A cold smile. The kind of smile that promised violence. By Friday, Bumpy said quietly, Red Hook will be mine. Tony laughed. A loud, mocking laugh. You think you can take my territory? You think you can walk into Brooklyn and take what's mine? Go ahead and try. You'll be dead by Wednesday. Bumpy stood up. He looked around the table. Made eye contact with every boss. Then he looked at Frank Costello. I apologize for disrupting your meeting, but I think we're done here. Bumpy walked out of the restaurant. Calm, unhurried, as if nothing had happened. But everyone in that room understood. War had just been declared. March 23rd, 1947, 6 o'clock in the evening. 3 hours after the meeting, Bumpy Johnson was back in Harlem, sitting in his office above Small's Paradise. With him were his top 5 men: Illinois Gordon, Junie Bird, Nat Pettigrew, Cadillac Charlie, and a young enforcer named Freddie Lucas, who would later become famous as Frank Lucas. Bumpy laid out the situation. Tony Carelli called me a street and are in front of 12 mob bosses. He thinks I can't touch him because he's Italian, because he has Frank Costello's protection, because Red Hook is his kingdom. Bumpy paused. We're going to prove him wrong. We're going to take Red Hook in 5 days. His men stared at him. Take Red Hook? Boss, Tony's got 50 guys. We're talking about Brooklyn. Italian territory. This could start a war with the entire Genovese family. Bumpy's response was simple. Frank Costello heard what Tony said. He didn't defend him. Meyer Lansky heard it. He didn't defend him. Every boss at that table heard Tony disrespect me with that word, and not one of them backed him up. You know what that means? It means Tony's on his own. It means if we take Red Hook, Frank's not going to war over it, because Tony violated the rules. He disrespected a made partner. Bumpy looked at each of his men. We're not going to war with the Italians. We're going to war with Tony Carelli, and we're going to win. But here's what nobody expected. Bumpy's strategy wasn't violence. Not at first. It was information. March 24th, 1947. Tuesday. Bumpy sent Junie Bird to Red Hook. Not to fight. Not to threaten. To talk. To ask questions. To learn. Junie spent 12 hours on the docks, talking to longshoremen, buying drinks in bars, learning who worked for Tony, who was loyal, who was scared, who wanted out. By evening, Junie had a list, 15 names, dock workers who hated Tony, union leaders Tony had threatened, business owners Tony had extorted, people who wanted Tony gone but were too terrified to act. Bumpy looked at the list. Perfect. We're not just taking territory. We're liberating it. March 25th, 1947. Wednesday, the day Tony predicted Bumpy would be dead. But that's when the real twist happened. Bumpy didn't attack Tony's operations. He attacked Tony's reputation. Bumpy sent word through the docks, through the bars, through the neighborhoods. The message was simple. Tony Carelli called Bumpy Johnson a racial slur. But Bumpy's not starting a war. He's offering a deal. Anyone who worked for Tony can switch sides, keep their jobs, keep their territory. Just don't work for a racist. Within 24 hours, 3 of Tony's top dock supervisors had switched sides. They came to Harlem, met with Bumpy, and agreed to work for him instead. Tony heard about the defections on Wednesday night. He was furious. He called an emergency meeting with his remaining crew, 47 men. Tony stood in front of them. This Harleman thinks he can steal my people. He thinks he can turn you against me. But you're loyal, right? You're with me, right? Nobody answered. Tony's paranoia was setting in. He started seeing traitors everywhere. March 26, 1947, Thursday. Bumpy made his first physical move. Not against Tony. Against Tony's money. Bumpy had learned from his defectors that Tony kept his weekly take at a warehouse in Red Hook. Every Thursday night, the money was collected, counted, then moved to a safe location on Friday morning. Bumpy hit the warehouse Thursday at midnight. 6 men, in and out in 10 minutes. They didn't kill anyone, didn't hurt anyone, just took the money. $250,000. Tony's entire week of collections. Gone. When Tony found out Friday morning, he lost his mind. He knew who did it. He knew where the money went. And he knew he had to respond. But what Tony didn't realize was that Bumpy had planned for his response. Tony sent 20 men to Harlem Friday afternoon. Their orders were clear. Find Bumpy. Kill him. Take back the money. But Bumpy knew they were coming, because one of Tony's 20 men was actually working for Bumpy. A mole, planted 2 days earlier. The 20 men walked into a trap. Bumpy had 40 men waiting. Not in Harlem. In Brooklyn. At the entrance to the Midtown tunnel. When Tony's crew tried to leave Brooklyn, they were surrounded. Bumpy didn't kill them. He disarmed them, took their weapons, took their money, and sent them back to Tony with a message. Red Hook is mine now. By Friday evening, March 28, 1947, exactly 5 days after the meeting, Bumpy controlled Red Hook. But Tony Carelli wasn't done. That night, Tony made a fatal decision. He was going to kill Bumpy personally. Tony took 5 of his most loyal men. They drove to Harlem, to Small's Paradise, where Tony knew Bumpy would be. They walked in at 10 o'clock, guns drawn, ready to end this. But Bumpy wasn't there. What Tony didn't know was that Bumpy had predicted this exact move, and he'd set another trap. Tony and his men walked into Small's Paradise. The club was packed. 200 people, music playing, drinks flowing. But the moment Tony drew his gun, the music stopped, and Tony realized every person in that club was armed. Every bartender, every waiter, every musician, every customer, and every gun was pointed at Tony. Bumpy Johnson walked out from the back office, calm, smiling. Tony, you came all the way to Harlem to see me. I'm honored. Tony's gun was shaking in his hand. You stole my territory. You turned my people. You took my money. Bumpy nodded. Yes, I did. Exactly like I said I would. By Friday, Red Hook would be mine. It's Friday. Red Hook is mine. Tony tried to aim his gun at Bumpy, but Illinois Gordon was faster. 1 shot. Tony the Bull, Carelli dropped the floor. His 5 men tried to run. They didn't make it out of the club. By 10:15, all 6 were dead. Bumpy called Frank Costello personally, told him what happened. Frank's response was simple. You defended yourself. In your own club. In your own neighborhood. No problem. Clean it up. And Frank added one more thing. Welcome to Brooklyn, Bumpy. March 29, 1947. The next morning, word spread through New York's underworld faster than fire. Tony the Bull, Carelli was dead, killed by Bumpy Johnson. And Bumpy now controlled Red Hook. The reaction was mixed. Some Italian mobsters were furious. A black gangster had killed one of their own, taken Italian territory. This was unprecedented. Others, like Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky, saw it differently. Tony had violated the code. He'd disrespected a partner. He'd refused to negotiate. He'd declared war. And he'd lost. The meeting Frank Costello called on April 2nd, 1947 was historic. Every major boss in New York attended. The topic was simple. What do we do about Bumpy Johnson taking Red Hook? Frank Costello spoke first. Tony Carelli used a racial slur against Bumpy in front of all of us. He declared war. He attacked Bumpy in Harlem. Bumpy defended himself. Tony's dead. That's the end of it. One boss, a man named Sal Marcano, disagreed. But Bumpy's black. We can't have black gangsters taking Italian territory. It sets a bad precedent. Meyer Lansky responded, "What sets a bad precedent is tolerating racism in our organization. We do business with Jewish gangsters, Irish gangsters. Why not black gangsters? If they're smart, if they're profitable, if they follow the rules, what difference does it make?" The room debated for 2 hours. Finally, Frank Costello called for a vote. Do we go to war with Bumpy Johnson over Red Hook? Or do we accept the new reality? The vote was 8-4. Accept the new reality. Bumpy Johnson officially controlled Red Hook, Brooklyn. And for the first time in American mob history, a black gangster had taken and held Italian territory. But here's what most people don't understand about what happened. Bumpy didn't just take territory. He proved something. He proved that racism was a weakness, that Tony's hatred had blinded him, made him underestimate Bumpy, made him predictable, and it had cost him everything. Over the next 20 years, Bumpy Johnson would expand beyond Harlem and Red Hook. He'd have operations in Queens, the Bronx, parts of New Jersey. He became one of the most powerful crime figures in New York, not despite being black, but because he understood power in ways that his racist enemies couldn't. Bumpy's wife, Mamie, wrote about this period in her memoir. She described how Bumpy turned racism into an advantage. She wrote that Bumpy told her, "When they underestimate you because of your skin color, they make mistakes, and I built an empire on their mistakes." Tony Carelli's family tried to retaliate once. In May 1947, Tony's younger brother Vince tried to take back Red Hook. He brought 30 men. Bumpy was ready. The fight lasted 15 minutes. Vince Carelli and 12 of his men were killed. The rest fled. After that, nobody challenged Bumpy's control of Red Hook. Years later, in 1965, a young mobster asked Frank Costello why the commission had allowed a black gangster to take Italian territory. Costello's answer became legendary because Bumpy Johnson earned it. He didn't steal it. He didn't get lucky. He earned it by being smarter, tougher, and more strategic than Tony Carelli. And when Tony disrespected him with that word, Bumpy made Tony pay. That's not about race. That's about respect. And in our business, respect is everything. The story of Bumpy taking Red Hook became a case study in mob circles. How one slur cost a man his life and territory. How racism makes you weak. How underestimating your enemy because of their skin color is a fatal mistake. Bumpy Johnson controlled Red Hook until his death on July 7, 1968. 21 years. During that time, Red Hook became one of the most profitable operations in New York. The docks ran smoothly. The unions were organized. Violence decreased. Because Bumpy understood something Tony never did. You don't control territory through fear alone. You control it through respect, through making people want to work with you instead of against you. When Bumpy died in 1968, Frank Costello attended his funeral. So did Meyer Lansky. So did dozens of Italian mobsters who'd once refused to sit at a table with him, because over 2 decades, Bumpy had proven he belonged, not because of his race, but despite having to overcome racism. When the eulogies were given at Bumpy's funeral, one speaker told the story of March 23, 1947, the day Tony Carelli called Bumpy a street and **************, the day Bumpy promised to take Red Hook by Friday, the day that changed everything. The speaker said, Bumpy didn't just take Red Hook that week. He took respect. He took recognition. He took his rightful place at the table. And he did it not with rage, but with strategy, not with hatred, but with excellence. That's what Bumpy taught us. That racism is their weakness, not ours. But the story has a final twist. In 1983, 15 years after Bumpy's death, a journalist was researching a book about organized crime in New York. He interviewed dozens of old mobsters. men who'd been active in the 40s and 50s. And almost every one of them mentioned March 1947, the month Bumpy Johnson took Red Hook from Tony Carelli. One old capo, a man named Jimmy Knapp who'd been at the meeting, gave the most detailed account. He said, "I was there when Tony said it. That word. And I saw Bumpy's face. Most men would have exploded, would have attacked right there. But Bumpy just smiled, like he knew exactly what was going to happen next, like Tony had just played right into his hands." Jimmy continued, 5 days later, Tony was dead. Red Hook was Bumpy's. And every one of us sitting at that table learned a lesson. Don't let your racism make you stupid. Because Bumpy Johnson was the smartest gangster in New York. And if you underestimated him because he was black, you'd end up like Tony, dead, forgotten, your territory taken by the man you thought didn't belong at the table. That interview was never published. The journalist died before finishing his book, but the recording exists, and it confirms what everyone in New York's underworld already knew. March 23rd to March 28th, 1947. 5 days that changed organized crime forever. The week a racial slur cost a man everything. And the week Bumpy Johnson proved that respect, not race, determined power. Look, the story of Bumpy Johnson taking Red Hook isn't just about gangsters. It's about dignity, about refusing to accept disrespect, about turning hatred into motivation. Tony Carelli thought he could dismiss Bumpy with a slur, thought he could keep Bumpy in his place, thought racism would protect his territory. He was wrong. March 23rd, 1947. One word, one promise. By Friday, Red Hook will be mine. 5 days of strategic warfare. Defections, financial attacks, information gathering, psychological warfare, and finally violence. By Friday evening, Tony was dead. His crew was scattered. His territory was Bumpy's. An entire New York underworld had learned a lesson. Don't underestimate Bumpy Johnson. Don't disrespect him. And never, ever think that your racism makes you superior. Because Bumpy Johnson proved that excellence transcends race, that strategy beats prejudice, that a man judged by his actions, not his skin color, can take everything from those who think they're superior. Tony Carelli died believing he was better than Bumpy Johnson because he was white. He died wrong. Bumpy lived another 21 years controlling Red Hook, proving every day that he belonged at that table, that he'd earned his place, that respect was earned, not given, and that racism was a weakness that smart men exploited. If this story about Bumpy Johnson's greatest victory got your attention, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel because we're dropping true crime history stories every single week. Drop a comment and tell me, was Bumpy justified in taking Red Hook? Should Tony have known better than to use that word? And turn on notifications because next week we're telling the story of how Bumpy Johnson walked into a room of 40 armed gangsters and walked out with their loyalty. Remember, in the world of 1940s organized crime, respect was everything. Territory was everything. And never underestimating your enemy was everything. Tony Carelli forgot all three. He disrespected Bumpy Johnson with a racial slur, and 5 days later, he was dead. March 23rd, 1947. One slur, one promise, 5 days, one territory taken, one lesson taught. Bumpy Johnson walked into that meeting as Harlem's boss. He walked out as Brooklyn's boss too, because when you disrespect a king, you lose your kingdom. And Tony Carelli learned that lesson the hard way, with his life and his territory.